Hello again, Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club here. As we near the end of our series in the endgame for kings and pawns, I wanted to take a look at some king and pawn endgames where both sides have at least one pawn, and an idea called pawn racing. Let's go ahead and get started. As we see the example here on the screen, black has a pawn that is only 2 squares away from promotion. White has 2 pawns and a king nearby. And so the idea here is that if black can get this pawn to promote to a queen before white can get one of his pawns to promote to a queen, then black is going to win. Unfortunately, in this example, white has a trick up his sleeve. Let's take a look. It's white's turn to move, and so white simply moves in close to his pawns, and black is off to the races. Now he's only 1 step away from the mighty queen. Well, what can white do here? So white's going to step in next to both of his pawns, and notice the threat. White is covering all 3 of the squares that are in front of black's king. Well, black gets to win the race and get his pawn, but the important part is that that queen came without a check. And we're going to see in future examples how queening with a check makes the difference. Because he did not queen with a check, white gets to move. And can you see the winning move here? Checkmate. White is covering both of his pawns, and the pawns are covering all the squares. Black's king is checkmated. So let's back that up. What we can see here is that if these pawns have their king's support, then checkmate can occur, which can totally interrupt the race. If, for instance, this king was, I don't know, way out of play down here, well, then when black decides to move, what are these white pawns going to do? If this pawn moves forward, black's just going to take a pawn and take a pawn. It needs the king's support. All right, let's move on. So here we have an example, again, where each side has 2 pawns. White's pawns are connected, so they're helping one another. That's good. Black's pawn, however, is only 2 squares away from checkmate. So a lot of crazy things can happen here. Let's start. So white makes a move here, and black is going to make a mistake. What move would you make as black here? Would you move your pawn towards queening? Would you capture this pawn or do something else? Let's take a look at what happens if black makes the mistake of capturing. It seems like a normal idea, but once white captures back, now white is very close to queening, and his king is nearby. So black races, white races, black gets his queen, and again, notice the queen comes without check, and that's very important. So once our pawn moves here, we enter a position in a queen versus pawn endgame. And if you haven't studied queen and pawn endgames yet, what we know about them is that if the side with the pawn has either a rook pawn or a bishop's pawn, rook pawn, any one of those pawns, it's going to end in a draw. And that's something you can study in queen and pawn endgames, but let's just see it play out. So black can move into position, trying to pin the pawn so that the pawn cannot promote. So the pin comes. Black's king seizes the queening square, hoping to help his pawn promote, because if he can get it to promote, and black's queen takes white's queen, and then the king takes the queen, and all we're left with is the 2 kings, that's a stalemate. Well, black doesn't want a stalemate, so he checks the king. White simply moves away from the pawn, hoping that he can get the pawn in to become a queen. Check, protecting the pawn. Check, forced to move away. And here's why queen and pawn is a draw. Soon as the queen captures, I hope you see this. Black's queen is covering these squares. White's king is stalemated. This is a draw. Let's go back to the beginning for a moment. What if black made a different decision? What if instead black moved the pawn to a2? Well, then white can advance his pawn and get closer to queening. But again, black wins the race. Now this time, black simply moves up the board, checking as he goes. or I guess as she goes, since it's a queen. And once we enter this same position, now when black captures this pawn, it's no longer a stalemate. Some of you may be saying, well, sure it is, because the king's not in check. White still has a pawn. White moves his pawn, and now all black's queen has to do is take one step. And what you'll notice here is that that square is available. The king is stuck in sort of a jail cell. This pawn cannot move. Now black's king can move in at his leisure, just one step at a time, while white's king is stuck moving back and forth, and then the kiss of death. So we can see from this position here that this was a very important decision to make, and this is why you want to know this endgame position, because it's not just as simple as winning the race. Let's go on to our next example. So here we have what looks like a fairly even race. 3 squares away, 3 squares away. But the important detail is this. These pawns are going to promote on the same diagonal. That means whoever promotes first, their queen is going to be attacking the promotion square of the other pawn. So if white got to move first, and black is one move behind, that means white promotes first, and now black can't promote. As soon as this pawn moves in, captured, and now it's just an endgame of queen and king versus king, and this is a win for white, assuming he doesn't blunder into a famous stalemated position. Again, know your queen endgames. So, if we move on to the next example, here we go. What we're going to do is we're going to change this up just a bit, where the king is a little bit closer. So now when the white pawn makes its move towards the queening square, and black makes its move, excuse me, it appears that potential spam is trying to call me. Once the queen happens, black has the opportunity to move next to the queening square and cover this square. Meaning that if black can promote and then white has to capture and black recaptures, it's now a draw instead of a loss. This is very, very important. It doesn't matter what white's queen does here. We could check and we just stay next to this important square. We could check and we just stay next to this important square. And it really doesn't matter what white does here. Eventually white's going to have to just capture the pawn and it's a draw. Or just chase him around saying check for an hour and then give up. All right, so let's move on to a famous study from 1921. Richard Reddy, 1921, shows how what we call the queen's draw. So what we can see here is this. If we remember from previous studies, the square of the pawn, we can see now the square that exists, and this king is clearly outside of this square. So the king runs to try and catch up to this pawn so that it doesn't become a queen. But he moves diagonally instead of straight down the board because he's also trying to get near his own pawn to promote here. So he's kind of got two goals. He's chasing both things with this one move. So that's why he moves diagonally. Black sees this and runs. Again, a diagonal motion. Black is off to the races, and now white changes paths and starts moving towards this queening square. Black wants his queen, and he's only one step away. White is now one step away. The difference here is that this pawn's square is available to black's king. So he steps into the square of the pawn. White claims the queening square. Black promotes. White promotes, but notice this time, white promoted with a check. And again, if you know your queen endgames, king and queen versus king and queen is almost always a draw. You could just go ahead and offer a draw here and move on. And this was available because he promoted with a check. So remember, promoting with a check has power. We can see that in this example by Adamson in 1922. It's very similar, inspired by Ready. We can see that white is just trying to get over here to get to the queening square to help his pawn promote. And we can see that black is off to the races. So there he goes. And if we look at this queening square, or entering the square of the pawn, I should say, white's king is too far away. But he still tries to intimidate black, and black continues to race. Then he redirects, moves the pawn. King has to get close, claim the queening square. Promotion, but again, promotion without check lacks power. Promotion with check has power. And this again, queen on queen, is going to end in a draw. So some of the things to remember when you're racing to see who promotes first, when each side has at least one pawn, promotion with the check has power. You want to keep an eye on the square of the pawn and make sure that your king can try and enter it. Using forces like opposition, triangulation, outflanking, or just having your king escort your pawn to the queening square. All of these are important ideas. Hopefully you've been watching our entire video series on king and pawn endgames, so you know what some of those other terms mean. Please take a moment, subscribe to our channel, and visit us on Facebook and click the like button. Until next time, we'll see you real soon.